Okay, video number 2 for the day. Are you ready? The discussion for this book is going to be delicious. If you are looking for a review of Big Fish by Daniel Wallace, you are definitely in the right place. This book is read in high schools and colleges, so if you are reading this for school, this actually might be a really excellent video for you to watch. The discussion part of, which you can see all the time signatures down below, because I read this with one of the book clubs that I'm part of, and the discussion was amazing in detail. And I would have done an audio recording, but some people there were not comfortable with an audio recording, so I took notes, I compiled everybody's thoughts and feelings, and the really cool aspects of this book that I never considered and stuff like that that other people did, so I'm really excited for the discussion part. For my new subscribers, I do a book look theme for most of my book reviews. Some of them are too obscure to actually do a book look for, or sometimes I just don't have the time and or energy to do it, so I just won't. But for the most part, I do a book look because I used to be a makeup artist and now I just have thousands of dollars worth of makeup that I don't usually use because I don't usually wear makeup on a day-to-day basis. So here I am. So my book look is actually inspired by the blues on the cover of the book. So I was really inspired by the dark blues with the light blues with the twilight kind of scene in the background, as well as the integration of the greener blues for the water and the catfish that the dude is riding. So there's also reference in it to like a siren / mermaid style creature, and then also a swamp girl. So that's where my book look is inspired. So it's like a mermaidy look. So a really quick synopsis for those who don't know what the book is about. Basically, we follow this gentleman whose father is dying, and he only knows these convoluted, mythical sort of stories about his dad. And on his father's deathbed, he basically is trying to ask his father, who are you really? So his father was very aloof during his upbringing. He was traveling all the time, supposedly for work. And on his father's deathbed, he basically asked his father, who are you really? What have you been doing with your life? And basically confronting him with, I really wish we had a better relationship. So the story is sort of told through a series of short stories, like very short stories, about the father's life. These are stories that the son already knows and is telling to us, the reader, about his father. But then we also see a few scenes where he's actually talking to his father in his deathbed, and his father is telling more stories that the son has never heard before. So it's told in a series of chunks, and they all have this kind of mythical, sort of magical realism / just magical aspect to them that seems too fantastical for reality. So his son constantly questions him, like, well, what does that really mean? Represent as a metaphor, and are you being serious when you say you've met a giant? Like, or do you just mean a really tall man? The book, like the father in the story, is quite aloof and is not very direct at all, and it does not take itself too seriously. For a spoiler-free review, I personally started off giving it a 3-point-star rating. Personally, I started off giving it 3.5 stars because yes, it was good in the writing and the storytelling, but I didn't understand it as deeply as I understand it now. So after my book club meeting, I actually upgraded it to a 4-star rating because it meant a lot more to me after the book club. The ratings that the other members of this book club gave were: one person gave a 3-star rating, 2 people gave a 3.5-star rating, which I counted myself in. And then 1 person gave it a 4-star rating and 2 people gave it 4.5-star rating. So it's kind of a mixed bag. So for a little bit of a spoiler-free review, which I can't get super detailed in, but basically, a lot of us struggled to like some of the characters. Beyond that, it's super short, so it's really easy to read. So I'm not upset that I read it, even though I didn't quite enjoy it as much as I hoped that I would, or, you know, you always hope it's gonna be a 5-star. But I'm really not upset that it was any less than that because of the discussion, and then also because it's so short. There was also a lot of discussion of whether or not it was purposefully, because of the time it was written in, and the time that it takes place in, that it was a little sexist. It's a great read for if you have to read something for school, because there's a lot to dissect, there's a lot to talk about, there's a lot to address, and it can really be interpreted, like most literature, in so many different ways. If you need to write a paper on like metaphors or similes, or if you need to write a paper on life and how literature connects to life, if you need to do a literature project on book versus movie, this is also a really great one. So I highly suggest this book to anyone who is in a literature class where they have to choose a book to do some kind of project and or paper on, and they don't know what to do it on, because it's short, it's easy to read, the stories are fun, the movie is great. Do I recommend this book? Sure. Mostly I recommend it to the students. It's at this point basically going to be a classic, if it isn't already. I know Daniel Wallace isn't like dead. It can't really be a classic because it hasn't outlasted the ages, but I think that it probably will because it's definitely turning into that kind of book. There's also a lot of commentary on like life and coming of age and pursuing passions or dreams and those types of things. So I think you will get the most out of this book if you read it with somebody else. So I encourage you, if you are going to read this, to find a buddy who will willingly read this with you, or if you want, you can always come back to this video and talk to me about it because there's so much to talk about, I don't know where to start. And with that, I'm going to move on into the discussion with spoilers. So this is gonna be a spoilery discussion. If you have not read the book, go no further. Please go and read the book, come back, and we will discuss. Whew, there's a lot to unpack. I took a lot of notes. The outline for this video is long because it's not just my thoughts and feelings, it's the thoughts and feelings of my book club. So I will try to be very clear about which of these thoughts and feelings are mine versus anyone else's in the book club, but things might get jumbled or mixed. So hopefully if you have questions about the things that I talk about, I can address them in the comments. So the first thing we need to talk about is the format. We felt it was important to keep in mind that as us, the readers, we're actually hearing these stories from the son. It's a retelling of stories that his father has already told him. We discussed a couple things like how his father could have told him a normal story, and because it's a retelling of the story, his child's like mind could have added all these magical aspects into it when he was young, and his father just kind of went, all right, yeah, sure, I met a giant. Or really, it could have just been that like his father did tell these fantastical stories, but when he went to retell them, he embellished a lot of the details. We all kind of felt like the smaller stories seemed like they were leading up to something big, and maybe at this point I actually feel like they did, but when I went into the book club I felt like they were all completely separated, that they have no connections whatsoever aside from maybe common themes like the wild dogs and stuff like that. Not that they had to add up to anything, it just felt like the book was building up to something and then it felt like nothing happened. The format was kind of a problem for a lot of us because the short stories did not seem to address each other. We weren't even sure how chronologically they were told, and so it was very it was confusing. As a reader who reads a lot of fiction that is chronological and does have a point and has a beginning, middle, and end and things like that, and a climax and all of that, like my brain struggles to want to take everything that I got from this book and put it into that order in a way that will translate the way I traditionally read. I've read other books that jump around in time. I've read other books that jump around in perspective, but I don't think I've ever read a book where there's separate stories that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, and then by the end of the book they still seemingly have nothing to do with each other. One person in my book club suggested that there's that one scene where the people who loved his father, who loved Edward Bloom, basically made a tent city in front of their house because they all wanted to be there for him on his last days. That all of these stories were basically just how he connected with people, the people he influenced, and the people's lives he made an impression on or saved or whatever, and to kind of paint this fantastical life. Give it substance by putting in that scene where everybody gets together and they're like, you know, we're all gonna get together. All of us were affected by Edward Bloom even though none of us are connected to each other. So there was one person in our club who suggested that that could have been the theme, that could have been the thing that connected all of these stories. There are also common themes like the wild dogs, water, swimming, fish, things like that. Those types of themes that all connected with each other. Traditionally in writing, water represents change and or you know, ebbs and flows and things like that, like the tide, you know, coming in, going out, and moving on. It represents all of these things, and it could be integrated into this story, but honestly, these stories did not feel that metaphoric. They felt pretty direct, like, I'm not telling you this story because there's a metaphor, I'm telling you this story because that's what happened. Then of course we have the death scenes, the 4 separate death scenes. This was a really fun thing to talk about in the books. We talked about how the first scene seemed like the most clinical, and then the last scene of the 4 deaths seemed the most mythical, magical. So the idea being that as we learn these stories about his father being told from his perspective, that every take on the father's death, the 4 separate different times that he told the story of his father's death, they become more and more magical because the son is becoming more and more accepting of the way his father is becoming more accepting of the fact that his father just tells these mythical stories. And so he's like, why not, Dad? Yeah, sure, you're turning into a fish. Sure, let's get in the car. I'll throw you into a river. And yes, I accept that that's just who you are. I accept that that's how you want to die, even though that's not reality. The takes on the 4 deaths seemed a lot about acceptance and integration of somebody's, like, you know, even if you completely clash with somebody's personality, just being like, okay, you know what? I get it. That's who you are. I accept it. That is your reality. And as much as I want you to meet me on a level playing field, and as much as I want you to meet me in the middle, I acknowledge you're just not going to be able to do that. And you know what? I accept you. That was kind of like a beautiful take on the whole idea of the deaths. So thank you, Haley Ann, for that insight, because that made the deaths a lot more, like, make a lot more sense to me. The organizer of the book club asked somebody in the book club to explain what these retellings might be or represent. As somebody who has experienced the death of both of her parents, I kind of related it to my experience, and so I will share that with you now. So when I was 15, my mother passed away. My father was not in the picture at this point. It was a very slow, long, drawn-out process. And her last words to me were, Stephanie, you're a butterfly flying aimlessly. I wish I could explain. And I said, it's okay. And she said, I love you. And I told her I loved her, and I went and took a nap. And by the time I woke up, she was gone. Those words, sometimes, depending on the stories of our lives together that I think about, make a lot of sense. Like, for example, we did competitive hula dancing together, and my mother's Hawaiian name is Lana'au, which means to wander aimlessly. So in a sense, I'm like, oh, she's tying in herself, and butterflies were never really a thing for us while she was alive, but they definitely became a huge part of my everyday life now that she's gone. You know, when I see butterflies, I think of her, and maybe that was what she meant by it. Maybe she meant for me to think of her every time I saw a butterfly, and they're so common most seasons that I could think of her all the time. Maybe she just didn't want to be forgotten. So here's all, like, just looking at that psychology, look at the ways that I am trying to justify the way that my mother spoke to me that day, and the words that she gave me, and how I'm connecting it to kind of this mythical idea that my mother is now going to exist in all the butterflies in the world, and every time I see a butterfly, that's her, and she's there, and she's watching over me, and she, you know, there are even times where, like, I go on a road trip, and within the first 5 minutes of the road trip, I'll see a butterfly, like, near my car or something like that, and I will think, oh, my mom really wants me to go on this road trip. Even though I don't actually believe that, I have these thoughts. So that could be what these 4 different takes on his father's death are like. I reacted probably the opposite that Edward Bloom would. Edward Bloom, if he experienced the death of his parent, would probably just let that story evolve as time went on, and he would never run it down because it was always meant to evolve into something else. When my mom passed away, I went immediately to the paper and I wrote down every detail I could remember. I still have those papers somewhere in my house because I didn't want anything about that day to change. I didn't want to forget anything about that day. I didn't want to forget the way she smelled, and the way that she sounded, and the way that she spoke, and the things she said, the things she watched. You know, I remember so many intimate details of that day that I know are fact and that will not change. Her last words will never be anything other than what they were. Like, I'll never change them to, she said she was a big fish or something like that. That is kind of what we went with for the whole 4 deaths in the different scenes. We must move on, otherwise this video is going to be a million years long. We talked about our favorite stories in the book. So personally, one of my favorite ones was the weird purgatory story where he goes into the town right after trying to leave Ashland, I think, and there's the dog who's biting people's fingers off, and they're all trying to convince him to stay, and that definitely being the doubt of what he's doing and his reservations, and showing that he has none because the dog believes that he can leave the town because he's ready, and or he has the resolve, and or he actually means it, whatever that means. And that scene made a lot of people in my book club actually uncomfortable, like had a physical reaction to that scene, because we all have those doubts. We all have that purgatory town in our head where we walk through the town and there's a rabid dog just taking bits of our soul and being like, no, you're not ready, and I'm not gonna let you, and I'm gonna hurt you until you stay in the comfort of what you know and what you know you can accomplish. So that scene was definitely a personal favorite of mine, and it definitely resonated with everyone in the book club, even if it wasn't their favorite scene. Most people loved the glass eye. story with the old woman, because for us, at least, we had different favorite stories because each of them resonated with a part of ourselves and or our lives that we would then explain, and then it would make a lot more sense as to why that one was their favorite. So maybe if you do have a favorite, maybe explore a little bit into the psychology of that, of why it's your favorite. Does it connect with your life happenings, or is it a part of who you are that it resonates with? So something to think about. Two of the least favorite stories being the Swamp Girl one, because nobody was really happy with the idea that he was having an affair, and then of course the Girdle one, because that both those together is what I was addressing earlier when I said that the book was kind of sexist a little bit. During the course of this book club, we actually got a fun fact from one of our members, Caleb, who said you can actually tickle trout. That trout are ticklish. And that makes me so excited to one day go find a trout and tickle it, because I really want to tickle a trout, which sounds really bad. It's not what I meant, not a euphemism. It's like a real fish trout. You can tickle it. So then we moved on to characters. How did you feel about the characters? So half of us really did not like the dad. So half of us felt like the dad was sexist, that he was self-serving, that he was selfish and narcissistic. We did not like that he was elusive in his child's life. We did not like the fact that he had a mistress. We did not like the fact that he seemed quite sexist and entitled, because he felt like entitled to own an entire town of people he did not know. I didn't like the fact that even on his deathbed, he as much effort as his son put forward to try to meet his dad halfway, or even by the end, how he kind of just lets go and just kind of accepts that he's not going to meet his father halfway, so he's going to have to be the one to budge, to be a part of his father's narrative of his own story. Just kind of drove me crazy, because that's the self-serving part of him that I did not enjoy. But half of us actually quite enjoyed the father character, like adored him almost, because it reminded them of their fathers, because their fathers are very much like this, where they tell these grand stories that just seem unreal, like they couldn't possibly have happened. The type of dad who will go off on a tangent of stories no matter what you say to them. So I never had that type of connection. I never had a father figure in my life, so I wouldn't know what that is like, and maybe that's part of the reason why I didn't like the father, is because I didn't have my own father to connect him to. However, if I had a father that was anything like this father, I wouldn't want him. That sounds horrible, but like, you know, I had a father who wanted nothing to do with my life. So at that point, I was like, okay, then I don't want anything to do with yours. If my father was gone more than he was there for me, and if my father had a mistress and was telling me stories about it, then I would just be like, okay, bye, I don't need you part of my life. Every character needs to have flaws. I get that. Like, otherwise they're very two-dimensional. Characters, to be good characters, need to be layered. And maybe the fact that I hate this father, maybe the fact that I hate Edward Bloom is a mark of good writing, because I'm having an actual emotional reaction to this character, which is kind of the point. So I'm not saying he's a bad character in the sense of the writing, but he is a person I would not get along with. He is a father I would disown, and he is not a good person in my perspective. When I said that in my book club, somebody pointed out, well, he did provide his family with a home and security and comforts and money, so it's not like he completely abandoned them, he just was never part of their life. And then they also pointed out, well, he is a good person. He saved all these lives, he did all these good deeds, did all these good things for all these other people while he was on his travels across the world, and, you know, all throughout his life. And I pointed out that while, yes, there are a lot of people who think of him as a really good person, as this wonderful, godlike gentleman who just kind of walks into their lives and just shows them magic and buys their town and saves their children from wild dogs and things like that, who's just this good guy. But if he's such a good guy, why is it that the people who are the most constant in his life, why is it the people that are closest to him are the ones who are hurt the most? Why is it that his wife cries when he's gone? And why is it that their relationship almost didn't survive? Why is it that their marriage almost didn't make it to the end? And why is it that his son is so dissatisfied with their relationship? If he's such a good person, why is it that the people he's supposed to care about most are the ones who are suffering the most? Where my argument is that even though he does all these good things, he puts himself in the situations to be the hero. It's not about helping people, it's about needing to be the hero of the story. So like the situation with the girdle, with the woman who came in, who was a horrible customer, who didn't want him to help her because he was a dude. He didn't just magically have the answer. He didn't just magically know exactly which girdle to get him. He went out and bought the girdle before anyone else knew it existed and hid it and kept it for himself and manipulated the situation and the people in the room into believing that they are inferior to him as a girdle presenter and or fitter. I don't know what to call him, a lingerie dude, because he knows the answer. He had the new girdle. Maybe in a way that would have been a good thing. Like maybe it could have been a hero moment if he had went out and bought the girdle ahead of time and then immediately presented it to her. But the fact that he hid it and waited to step in as the hero with the magic girdle that would turn this woman into the most beautiful woman ever that existed, I did not like that. Did not like that about his character. And I don't know that you could convince me otherwise, because I also felt like that part was a little bit sexist. Like, I don't fault him for being a male in a female-dominated space, but he was a male in a female-dominated industry and space that needed to be the best. Like, he needed to be better than all the other women clerks. It does not take into account that this woman, who has had a few husbands, so maybe this isn't true, but like, she could have been sexually assaulted. Maybe that's why she didn't want a dude to help her. He doesn't consider any of these things. So he's not considerate. I think he's self-serving. I think he seems like the hero because he puts himself in the position to be the hero. And then of course there's the affair. So like, what kind of good person who actually cares about his family has an affair? Go home, divorce your wife and your child, who you seem to have no interest in, and then go marry the swamp girl. But not only does he unofficially marry the swamp girl and like buy her land, even though she's adamant she doesn't want to like sell it, he basically abandons her because he only sees her once a month. And how fair is that? Like, and then she literally turns into swamp girl again, who lost her heart and her soul, and we never get a resolution to that character. We never find out if she finds love again. We never find out if he ever goes back for her or if he even tries to help and or fix her. Just created this horrible situation and then was like, oh, well, that sucks. And I turned this really beautiful young woman who's 20 years my junior, by the way, in case that was not apparent, and turned her into a swamp girl. I find absolutely nothing appealing about this man. You know who else is charming in this world? Who people think are good people, who do good deeds, who donate to good causes? Psychopaths, serial killers. Most serial killers and psychopaths are really charismatic and likable people. They're people you would probably call, outside of their side hobby of killing people and being a horrible person to other people, like a good person. There are serial killers who have had families, who have provided for those families, but then, you know, in his evenings he goes off and he does horrible things, and then he comes back and he's like, yeah, I'm a good guy. I've like saved lives today. I saved like 5 lives today, but I also murdered this girl. But I also saved the 5 lives, so don't forget about that. I don't think that his good deeds did enough for him for me to call him a good person. I'm glad he did the good deeds. I'm glad he saved the lives. I gotta admit that, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't think he did it for anyone else other than himself. He very possibly could be a psychopath. Maybe the whole point of the purgatory scene is that the dog let him through, not because he was special and godlike. He had conviction to his determination of being a traveler and a good, amazing person. Maybe it's because he didn't have a soul to even bite on. Maybe that's the point of that whole scene. This dog who eats people's ambition and soul, basically, to keep them from leaving, couldn't get a nibble out of this guy because he wasn't made of the same thing as every other human. Not because he's a god, but because he's a soulless, horrible person. So yeah, I have a lot of strong feelings about him. But I do also understand why you would like him. He is charismatic, he has saved lives, and he overall doesn't seem to do a whole lot of damage, with the exception of the people who love him most. But you know, there's that. So when it comes to the writing, like I addressed the fact that I think that Edward Bloom is sexist. We can't tell if that was on accident or if Daniel Wallace kind of wrote that in there without realizing that it was sexist, because at the time he wrote this, feminism was not necessarily as prominent and social media was not as big, so we weren't talking about it necessarily as much. Or if it's because it was written roughly in the 1920s to the 1980s, like that was the time that it was set in. So during those times, of course, feminism is not something that is considered as much, and definitely women had different ideas of what their roles should be, and society had different ideas of what their roles should be. So I feel like potentially he did it on purpose to represent the time in which it is written. I haven't read any other Daniel Wallace novels, so if you have, let me know if his writing seems a little sexist in other novels as well, because I can't tell if it's the writer or if it's the writing. So something I don't actually normally talk about that I probably should talk more about is the cover. So the cover is very interesting. So none of us were particularly a fan of the cover of this book. This book club in particular, you know, either most of us have or do work at a bookstore. So we talked about how we would see it on the shelves and there would be nothing appealing about it, nothing that drawed them to the book. It used to have a different cover of like a child sitting under a tree, I think, but this is the most common cover and this is the one that we all purchased, with the exception of the people who read it on Kindle, like me. One person in our club kind of was upset with the cover just because they felt that it had nothing to do with the story itself. Aside from like the obvious, it's a big fish. But one thing that I liked that I pointed out, they didn't represent the fish as the man. They compared the man to the fish, which I think is comparing the reality of Edward Bloom to the myth of Edward Bloom. On the cover, you will notice that the man is smaller than the big fish in in a little pond. I'm assuming the whole line that is supposed to represent for the cover and the title of the book. But what you will notice is that the fish is bigger than the man, which gives me a sort of narrative that Edward Bloom as a man in reality, who was just an adulterer, who was a controlling, entitled, had to own everything type of dude in this time, was never as big as he ever was as a myth, as the big fish. That the myth of him was bigger than who he actually was as a person. And that's what I think the cover kind of represents. And the idea that he's riding the fish is the idea that he rode his myth. Like, that carried him through life. That is how he lived his life, is riding on the back of this myth of himself, because he never felt good enough in reality to be his own person, to be the dude swimming in the lake instead of having to be a fish to swim in the lake. That was kind of our interpretation. Otherwise, I really like the colors of the cover, but other than that, there's nothing really all that appealing about the cover itself. And that is the symbolism that I took out of the cover that probably was never meant to actually exist, but you know. On the topic of the myth of Edward Bloom, we got a little taste of what it must be like to be a villager or a townsperson or some random person in, you know, that he knew in college to encounter Edward Bloom. What it must feel like to know Edward Bloom as this amazing, hilarious savior character, because there's a lot of dad jokes and really, really good jokes in general in this book. Everyone in this book club, at some point or another, if not multiple times throughout the book, would stop, go find their significant other, their parents, or their kids, and be like, you need to hear this joke. And we would tell the joke, we would have a good laugh. In the club meeting itself, we were actually reminiscing on all the different jokes that were told and our favorites, and we retold some of them, and we were laughing so hard remembering these jokes, and we kind of imagined that that is probably what it's like to remember Edward Bloom as somebody who isn't his mistress, his wife, or his child, and why all these people that camped outside of his house supposedly on his deathbed think he's so amazing. Because if that is all I knew of Edward Bloom, is if you just gave me a book of his jokes and told me these were written by Edward Bloom, like Edward Bloom was the inventor of all these jokes, I would be like, Edward Bloom seems like a pretty good guy. It's kind of like the comedians we see on TV. Like, they're really funny, so we're like, you seem like a good person, and then they get caught in sex scandals and you're like, ooh, you're probably not as good of a person as I thought you were, but you make me laugh, so, you know. So it's kind of like the jokes in the book were the way that other people that aren't close to him experience Edward Bloom as a person. Now, my boyfriend, without reading the book, knows who Edward Bloom is. He knows that name. So if ever somebody was like, hey, have you heard of that guy Edward Bloom? He's like, oh yeah, my girlfriend told me about him. He told her like a really funny joke. You're like, yeah, that's hilarious. Edward Bloom is a funny guy. We associate funny with, like, you know, charismatic. We associate charismatic with, like, good. That was a really interesting aspect of this book. And I don't know if it was purposeful, but if it was, that was brilliant. That was a really good use of something that we could have a physical reaction to in the world through laughter, which he mentioned he just wants to fill the world with laughter and smiles and stuff like that. He has like a line like that in the beginning of the book at some point. So then there's the movie, and I haven't seen the movie for many years, and it's really hard to get a hold of online without pirating it, so I haven't rewatched it yet. We do plan on all getting together again as a book club to watch the movie to compare it to the book, but most of us had already seen it at one point or another. Last time I saw it, I think, was closer to when it came out, or back in the day when you used to watch cable TV and it would just be on the TV and you'd be like, oh, okay, I'll watch this. So I've watched it a few times actually, and I remember very specific parts of it, but I don't remember the whole thing as a continuous story. Things I do remember about it is that the story actually had an overarching story, and that the stories blended together, that characters walked from one story into another before they made their exit. And then they added that one character who just stuck with him throughout the story, who ended up being the Swamp Girl. She also was with him throughout a bunch of the other stories that she's just not with him in the book. Ewan McGregor, yum. So there's that. Love Tim Burton. I think the movie did what readers will struggle with this book, and that is trying to come up with an overarching story. That's trying to connect all the stories to make one continuous meaningful story. Ultimately, if I had to put it all together, I would say this book is not actually about the stories that are told. I would say that this book is about humanity, and it is about how well do you know a person, and it's about the myth of who we are versus who we actually are. And it's commentary on the two sides of everybody, the person you want people to see you as and the person that you actually are. So I would argue that that is what the whole commentary of this book, or the theme of this book, actually is. I can't speak for the writer, and of course everyone's going to interpret this book differently. Some people are reading this as just a compilation of really short stories that they enjoyed. So, and that's just as valid as my whole hypothesis. This is going to be fun to edit because it's going to be really long, because there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot happening here. There's a lot more that we discussed, but I'm going to leave it with these topics for now, and then we can talk about this book in the comments. Let me know if you agreed with anything I said, or if you disagreed, and let me know what your favorite stories in the book were. Did you like Edward Bloom as a character or as a person? Is he the type of person you would want as a father? Is he the type of person you could be friends with? How did you feel about the son? Did you think he was being fair, or do you think he was being too compromising or not compromising enough? I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. This was such a fun book club read, so if you have a book club, I think that having this as your book club read is probably a really good idea, because it was really fun to discuss, especially with book lovers like us. So that's all I have for that for now. I am participating in the Strike Backathon, so I will be posting every day that I can for the next 30 days on this channel, so look forward to those. Otherwise, I do have a review coming out on Saturday for Still House Lake and Kilman Creek by Rachel Kane, which is a duology, a mystery thriller. I'm really excited to do that. And then on Sunday, I'm meeting for my book club for Off to Be the Wizard by Scott Meyer, which I will record as much of it as I can, and then I will post on February 3rd for my book review. So until tomorrow, I will definitely see you later. Bye!